Today I'm going to be answering a question for you that was posed to me in a recent Surface Design Association meetup. We were talking about stitching on paper, and someone asked the question, why would you as a textile artist want to stitch on paper instead of fabric? So I actually stitch on a variety of materials, and there are a few factors that go into answering that question. So the first of those is often the size of the project. So for example, let's take this project here. I have been working on this painting for 2 years. It's on canvas, it's acrylic. This uses the reverse coloring technique that I use in some of my work. So it means that very little planning went into this. And partway through, as I'm sort of revealing the images and deciding on the textures and patterns that I want to add into it, I had the idea that I wanted to stitch onto the canvas. Now, with my experience of stitching on alternative materials, I should have known better, but I started stitching directly onto the canvas itself. And this proved to be quite an undertaking. What I should have done was to trace out these elements of the hair here where I had begun the stitching, and I should have then stitched onto paper and collaged it on. The reason that I should have done that is because when you take something that is this large in size, you can see how big this piece is in relationship to me. Larger pieces are harder to stitch on. It's not something I can easily hold in my lap like a traditional embroidery hoop. The canvas is also hard to see through. So with some fabrics, when you're stitching, you're able to get an idea of, you're kind of like poking on the back and you can see where the needle's going to come through. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do exploration with the needle on the back of the project if it's canvas, because once there's a hole in the canvas, the hole is in the canvas. Canvas like this is not forgiving like fabric is. The same technically goes with paper. But this project was just very unwieldy. So if you can imagine, I'm holding it like this. I'm trying to do the stitch. I'm having to flip the entire canvas over. I'm fighting with this board on the back in a couple of places here. This is like a bar that has the frame here, and obviously it doesn't give. So I'm trying to stitch by sliding my hand and the needle underneath. It's quite difficult and very quickly becomes uncomfortable. So one of the reasons you might want to stitch on paper instead of fabric is because you want something lightweight that you can adhere to another surface if something that you're working on is very large. So let's talk about that too, about the type of material. So I mentioned the canvas. If I were going to stitch on something like this wood board, and I do like painting on wood, it's something I need to do more often, but if I was going to stitch on this, I would have to drill holes throughout the wood for whatever I wanted to stitch on. And because of the way this material is, and the way that you would conduct embroidery and stitching, I might be limited as to the type of stitching I could do or as to how much detail I could embroider upon it. So then I could either choose fabric or paper and then add it to this piece in a collage style form. And that gives me the versatility of layering in products, adding dimension, helping enhance the story, and just overall making it easier for me to work. So talking again about fabric versus paper. When you're doing that, sometimes fabric, and I'll show you here with this one. I don't know if you can see, there's like strings coming off here on the edge. Some fabric frays. So sometimes you're going to want a frayed edge because that's adding some texture to your piece, but other times you're going to want a nice clean edge. So in that case, if I want a clean edge and I want to guarantee that the edge is going to stay clean, I'm going to either then choose felt, or I am going to choose paper, and then I will stitch on that. If I want to ensure that something remains less pliable, I might choose paper. So for example, when you take this fabric, there's a couple pieces of fabric here. There's a piece of cotton linen, and there's a piece of felt. So felt can be quite stiff. This one is very stiff. It bounces back. It holds its shape really well. This is really floppy. It has a lot of flexibility and bend. The other thought would be if I'm using paper and I want something to hold a fold, it may be easier for me to use paper where I can bend it. And you know how you bend and crease paper and it will hold its shape more. So depending on how I want the material to hold its shape, I may choose fabric or paper. And there are, of course, mediums that I can use to manipulate different materials, to do different things. So all of those kind of factor in about what I'm wanting to do, what type of story I'm wanting to tell with the piece. Going back into the idea of weight, when you are collaging different materials or adding different materials onto something, you want to consider the weight of the project. So some fabrics are going to get really heavy if you put a lot of fabric layered in there, both visually heavy and physically heavy, depending on the fabric. So you want to consider both the visual weight and the actual physical weight and how that plays into the composition of your piece. So that's, again, another factor I'm considering when I am considering paper versus fabric. The other thing are the types of materials I'm using as far as like paint. Yes, you can add fabric, I guess you would say fabric mediums to certain acrylic paints to make them into fabric-based paints. But sometimes when you're painting with acrylics, they harden some of the fabrics in such a way that it's not as easy to manipulate or use them. Whereas like in this one, I've used watercolor, so the fabric stays, perfectly pliable for me. But as far as using acrylic paint, it might make this a little crispy or crunchy, or the paint might flake off. So you have to really think about what is your end goal, and even how the piece is going to be displayed. I'll get into that in a minute. But what is your end goal with the piece? What is the story you're trying to tell? What are you trying to accomplish? Are there certain techniques you're trying to use? And would fabric or paper be better suited to what you're trying to accomplish? And as far as the end display of a piece, fabric can often add a lot of dimension. And depending on what you're working with, and even going back to the idea of weight, if this were a large piece of paper and I start collaging fabric here, the weight of the fabric might pull that paper forward, might cause it to buckle. So I have to consider how the base material is going to act in relation to how I am going to display the art piece. Am I going to hang it? How am I going to hang it? Am I going to be displaying it flat? Is it going to be more sculptural? Is it like a three-dimensional sculpture in that case? Am I going to have whatever this is behind a glass frame? All of these are factors that I consider when I'm choosing fabric versus paper. And just having the choice gives me so much versatility in the number of mediums that I can use. And to me, that's exciting. That's why I'm a mixed media artist. I want to be able to use all the tools. I want to have all of the options. It gives me a lot more ability to be flexible with my art choices. Gives me more flexibility in the stories that I want to tell. And it gives me the ability to experiment and play a lot more than if I just limited myself to one medium, such as, say, just to textiles only. So hopefully that answers the question. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.